Well, hello there, boys and girls. I hope y'all had a good break, a good time to reflect on the things that are important to you and at least get away from all of this stuff that was going on here at the building. Give you a chance to sort of energize and things like that. We want to start things off this new semester and new year. Happy 2021, by the way. Talking about the circulatory system, right? That's what we're starting off with for this unit. For this semester, we're going to start with blood, what it is, what its function is, some of the processes that go in there. A little bit later, we'll talk about the heart. We'll do some anatomy stuff. We'll do some physiology. How does the heart beat and things like that. We'll talk about blood vessels, like what's really the difference between arteries and veins and stuff like that. And then kind of segue past that as we're going through talking about some of the stuff with our project that will roll out eventually. So let's go ahead and kick things off, I guess, and we'll talk about blood. All right, so let's talk about blood here for just a little bit, what's going on inside of our veins and things like that. We're talking about blood. We're talking about what's going on inside of the cardiovascular system. The cardiovascular, also known as the circulatory system, we're going to use those terms interchangeably throughout this unit. We've got a pump, which is the heart, and a series of conducting hoses, which are the blood vessels, the arteries, veins, the capillaries, and a fluid connective tissue, that is the blood. And so we'll talk about the functions of blood, and we'll talk about the components of blood. And we'll get into some of the other stuff also, like what makes it a connective tissue and stuff like that. So blood is made up of a bunch of different stuff. It's a very specialized connective tissue. All the cells are suspended in a fluid matrix. So that's our extracellular matrix. That's what makes it a connective tissue. The blood has a lot of different functions, including transporting materials, dissolved gases, nutrients, hormones, wastes, stuff like that. It also helps regulate pH, ions, composition of interstitial fluids. So you remember we talked about the sodium-potassium thing and the concentrations outside of your nerve cells and calcium in your muscle cells and stuff like that. And restricting fluid losses at injury sites. We're going to talk about blood clotting and stuff like that later. Defending against toxins and pathogens. That's our white blood cells, which we'll talk a whole lot more in about 6 weeks when we do the immune system. Also stabilizes body temperature, circulating warm blood throughout the body and either bringing it to the surface to decrease temperature or keeping it away from the surface to increase temperature. Characteristics of blood include its temperature. It's about 38 degrees Celsius, maybe a little bit less than that. It's a very high viscosity. So viscosity is kind of think of it how thick of it is. So something with low viscosity would be water. Something with high viscosity would be oil or blood or something like that. It's slightly alkaline. Blood volume, as far as that is concerned, we have 7% of our body weight is just the blood. So a 165-pound person, which would be average, I guess, approximately has 5.25 liters of blood, which is 5.4 quarts of blood. Now, if you're donating blood, we donate by the pint. And so if we're doing pints, we're looking at 2 pints per quart, so you double that one, so there's about 10 pints of blood in an average human. If you're bigger or smaller than average, you're going to have a little bit less or a little bit more, depending on your size. Breaking blood into its different parts, Whole blood is what we think of that has all of the different pieces involved. And whole blood is broken into two parts, basically. We have plasma, which is the liquid part, and that makes about 55% of your blood volume. Could be a little bit more, could be a little bit less, depending on how much water you have in your body and stuff like that. And then the formed elements right here, which is about 45%, and these are all of the cells and cell fragments. Now, the plasma also contains the ions, the hormones, proteins, and stuff like that. Those are dissolved in the plasma. And then the formed elements, white blood cells, red blood cells, and platelets, those are all the ones that are formed in other parts of the body, in the bone marrow, which we'll talk about later. The majority of the formed elements are red blood cells, 99.9%. There are diseases characterized by very high white blood cell counts, like leukemia. They're abnormally large, basically. And depending on what you want to do with it, like if let's say you're going to donate plasma, then you're going to set the blood through a process known as fractionation. Let me spell that for y'all. Fractionation, and that's just separating all the various parts of whole blood. So you go to the blood bank, you can just donate plasma, they give you back the formed elements. You can just donate blood cells, platelets, whole blood, all of that stuff. Plasma, the part that makes up the majority of your blood, is mostly water. More than 90% of it is going to be water with other proteins and solutes. It's very similar to the interstitial fluid. That's the fluid that's around all of your cells and stuff like that. And this is important because the ions that we have to exchange, either putting into the interstitial fluid or putting them in the bloodstream to be used elsewhere, happens at the capillaries. And we'll talk about, when we do the blood vessels, we'll talk about capillary exchange and kind of how that works, and oxygen exchange and stuff like that at that point. Some important proteins that are found in plasma include albumin. That's most of the proteins. They contribute to osmolarity. So when we talk about the kidneys, and we'll get into a lot greater detail about how water concentration is regulated in the blood. A lot of it has to do with albumin and the processes of driving water movement because of this protein. It's also a major transport protein for fats, hormones, and stuff like that. You've got globulins, which is another big part, about 35%, and these are your antibodies. For the most part, immunoglobulins are antibodies. You also got other ones that are transport globulins, like steroid-binding proteins, other hormone-binding proteins, lipoproteins, your HDLs and your LDLs. If you've ever known anybody who's done a blood test or anything like that, high-density and low-density lipoproteins. You've also got fibrinogen. Fibrinogen is a blood-soluble, so a water-soluble protein that is important in clotting, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Eventually, it's going to turn into fibrin, which is important in blood clotting. And then there's other plasma proteins that are enzymes and other hormones and stuff like that. Most of your plasma proteins are going to be made in your liver. Your liver is super important. We'll talk about your liver when we get to the digestive system. Albumins, fibrinogen, the globulins are all made in your liver. Your antibodies, the immunoglobulins, are made by plasma cells. Those are specialized white blood cells, which we'll get into that process in greater detail when we do the immune system. And peptide hormones, which are made by your endocrine organs, make up the rest. Then we have our formed elements, which is the remaining part, that 45% or so, which are, like I said earlier, your platelets, your white blood cells, and your red blood cells. And the process of the formation of these formed elements is hemopoiesis. Hemopoiesis. It's blood cell formation. Red blood cell and white blood cell and platelet. So we're going to focus on red blood cells. White blood cells we spend a lot of time on in the immune system, so I'm not really going to touch on those that much, and then we'll talk about platelets. Platelets are actually pretty simple as far as formation and stuff is concerned. So here are three components of the formed elements of blood: the red blood cells, the white blood cells, and the platelets. Going into red blood cells, also known as RBCs, that's the shorthand form. They can also be called erythrocytes. Wrong one. So your red blood cells are also known as erythrocytes. They make up 99.9% of the formed elements, and they contain a protein called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin's super duper important. It gives blood its red color. Now there are organisms that do not have red blood. Horseshoe crabs, for example, they have a different substance that gives it that, I think it's blue color. And it's primarily responsible for transporting oxygen and carbon dioxide. Red blood cell count, that's really important. It's a standard blood test that's done and stuff like that, which is the number of RBCs per microliter of blood. Now, in adult males, anywhere from 4.5 to 6.3 million. In females, it's a little bit lower, 4.2 to 5.5. There are certain diseases that are characterized by very low RBCs, like anemia. You can also have too high a red blood cell count also. Hematocrit is a term you may see sort of flopping around somewhere, which is also known as the packed cell volume. And that's basically the percentage of the blood that is all of the formed elements. So it's basically the non-liquid part, including all the stuff that's dissolved in the liquid, like the ions. In males, we're looking at about 46%. In females, it's a little bit lower, about 42%. They can also look, that's when they will study the hematocrit to get the red blood cell count. Okay, so red blood cells are another one that are pretty unique, like muscle cells and nerve cells. Red blood cells are very small, very highly specialized. They transport gases, carbon dioxide and oxygen. They are biconcave discs. Biconcave discs, which means they've got, think of like a lifesaver, basically, if you were to fill a hole in there. So the center part right here is a lot thinner than the outer part, kind of like a bowl on both sides. Smarties, kind of a good analogy of the idea that we're going after. So important things about the red blood cells as far as their structure related to their function. They have a very high surface area to volume ratio, which means they can take up oxygen very, very quickly. They form stacks called rouleaux, right, if you look right there. And you can sort of see them stacking up, almost like if you're stacking up plates, basically. And this allows them to very quickly and very smoothly go through capillaries, because capillaries are only one cell big, to allow that gas exchange to take place at that cellular level. The cells will actually bend and flex when they're going into these capillaries, which allows the much larger blood cell to pass through the much smaller capillary. Blood cells are somewhere in the neighborhood of 7.8 micrometers, which is super tiny, and a lot of your capillaries are 4 micrometers. So they're very flexible, like rubber frisbees. Let's see, other things about red blood cells. Mature red blood cells are anucleate. That means they do not have a nuclei. During the process of cell formation, the nucleus is actually ejected. They also lack ribosomes and mitochondria, so they're not able to make their own energy or synthesize proteins. They're not able to repair damage either. So once they're made, they're just out there until they die, which is about 100 to 120 days. Another thing that's important about red blood cells is this hemoglobin molecule. So hemoglobin is a protein that is found in red blood cells. There's a bunch of hemoglobin in red blood cells that are primarily responsible, well, not primarily, they are responsible for transporting respiratory gases, oxygen, carbon dioxide. They have a complex quaternary structure. Remember way back in like September, October, we talked about protein structure. Quaternary is those subunits put together. We've got 4 subunits. We have 2 alpha chains, which are these purple ones, and 2 beta chains, which are these blue ones. And each beta chain has a heme group, which is this really complex molecule with an iron in the center. The iron's the important part. So each hemoglobin molecule has 4 hemes. Each red blood cell has boatloads of hemoglobins. Each heme can hold 1 oxygen or 1 carbon dioxide atom. So one red blood cell can hold boatloads of carbon dioxide and oxygen, depending on where it is. The iron actually interacts with the oxygen to form a complex known as oxyhemoglobin. Also known as HbO2. Now, hemoglobin can be shortened to HB. So if you see that, just know that it's hemoglobin. Hemoglobin carrying oxygen, stuff like that, super important. Fetal hemoglobin, which is hemoglobin in a developing fetus who hasn't been born yet, binds to oxygen a lot more easily than the maternal hemoglobin, and that's really important because we have more oxygen in the air around us than can be dissolved in a liquid at any point. And so the fetus needs to be able to take in as much of that oxygen that's dissolved in the mother's blood as possible. Then eventually, when the baby is born and it starts breathing air, then it shifts production into regular hemoglobin, I guess you could call it. Hemoglobin function. So I said boatloads, right? 280 hemoglobin molecules. So each red blood can cover over 1 billion molecules of oxygen. Same thing with carbon dioxide. In the peripheral capillaries, so like capillaries in my fingers, for example, O2 is low, and it's a pressure thing, which we'll talk about later. Hemoglobin is going to release that CO2, so it's kind of like a concentration gradient, and it's going to take up carbon dioxide. It's going to form carbaminohemoglobin. Carbaminohemoglobin, and that's how carbon dioxide is transported to your lungs. The conditions are worse. There's high oxygen pressure in there, so it's going to release that carbon dioxide and bind that CO2 and carry that oxygen back to the peripheral tissues, and then the process is going to start over again. Anemia is one of those disorders that's characterized by either hemocrit, so you physically have fewer red blood cells, or your red blood cells have low hemoglobin numbers, which interferes with oxygen delivery to peripheral tissues. And so people who don't eat a lot have deficiencies of iron in their diet, for example, will become anemic. This is typically more of a risk for females, especially after the onset of puberty, because of the amount of blood loss each month during the menstrual cycle. So it's really easy for females to become anemic if they don't eat foods with iron, red meat, spinach, other dark leafy green vegetables, for example. Red blood cell formation and turnover. Every day, about 1% of your red blood cells is replaced. 3 million new blood cells enter your bloodstream each second. Other disorders of the red blood cells include a disease known as sickle cell anemia. sickle cell anemia is a genetic disorder characterized by abnormal hemoglobin. If you look at this picture right here, the hemoglobin actually changes the shape of the red blood cell into this sickle shape. It causes a lot of problems. If somebody has sickle cell anemia, these sickle cells will actually stick together and block blood vessels, not allowing blood to pass through. It's a very difficult disorder to live with. It's not impossible, but it's very difficult. However, something that's interesting is carriers of one allele, i.e. heterozygous individuals, are actually resistant to malaria. Now, check this out. I want you to tell me, what do you notice about these two maps? One of them is the prevalence of sickle cell anemia in certain regions of Africa, and the other map is a distribution map of a particular type of mosquito. This particular mosquito is responsible for carrying the malaria parasite. So if you notice, there's overlap between the prevalence of sickle cell anemia in Africa, and you would also find this in other you could potentially find this in other places where malaria is a big problem, but it's primarily we focus on it in Africa. The prevalence of sickle cell anemia lines up with the prevalence of the distribution of the malaria-carrying mosquito. And basically what ends up happening is the malaria parasite cannot feed on the red blood cells. Malaria is bad because the parasite feeds off your red blood cells. The parasite cannot feed on these sickle cell red blood cells. And so the parasite dies. And basically, it's a switch thing. When your system is stressed, then your blood cells you start creating abnormal hemoglobin, so your cells are sickle shaped. Once that stress is removed, i.e. from the lack of malaria in your system, then your blood cell production goes back to regular, healthy blood cells. This is thought to be why, from an evolutionary perspective, why people of African descent are more likely to develop sickle cell anemia than people of other racial backgrounds, because of this distribution and this evolutionary protection against malaria. So, there you go. Let's see. Let's talk about red blood cells a little bit more. Erythropoiesis is the actual formation of red blood cells. In embryos, embryonic blood cells move from the bloodstream to the liver, the spleen, the thymus, and the bone marrow. They differentiate into blood stem cells, basically, and then those stem cells will produce blood cells, depending on what type of stem cell they are. They turn into the particular blood cell. In adults, this only occurs in myeloid tissue, also known as your red bone marrow. So in embryos, blood cell production happens a lot more quickly because it happens in a lot more places. And once you become adults, you sort of transition away from that, and so your blood cells are only produced in your red bone marrow. So here's a flow chart kind of showing the production of red blood cells. And so we have cells called hemocytoblasts. Hemocytoblasts. These are also known as hematopoietic stem cells. Okay. Now, there's two types of hemocytoblast. We have myeloid cells, which turn into red blood cells and some of the white blood cells, and then lymphoid cells, which become lymphocytes. That's a type of white blood cell, which we'll talk about later. So basically what ends up happening is this. Hematologists, which are people that study blood, have identified several stages. The first part is you have a myeloid stem cell. That myeloid stem cell, also known as also known as a proerythroblast, turns into a basophilic erythroblast. These are the erythroblast stages that we're talking about right here. So we're talking about this section. Okay. Goes through 3 stages there over the course of 3 days. And then from there, the nucleus gets ejected around day 5 to day 7 to produce something called a reticulocyte. A reticulocyte. Okay. And then from there, we have it enters the bloodstream where it turns into a mature red blood cell, and then it hangs out for 120 days or so. Erythropoietin is a hormone that stimulates this process. It's secreted by the kidneys and the liver primarily when oxygen levels are low. This is known as hypoxia. So if you're in a low oxygen environment or something like that. It requires a lot of things, amino acids. Okay, so protein is important. Iron, folic acid, B12, and B6 are all important nutrients that are required for red blood cell production. A lack of vitamin C can lead to something known as pernicious anemia, which is a lack of red blood cells. Also, sort of the opposite of this, anemia is having not enough. There's a process known as blood doping. A lot of athletes try to do it. A lot of racers, they've gotten in trouble in the past with blood doping, where basically what they would do is they would reinfuse red blood cells, extra red blood cells, especially ones that are like super oxygenated, back into your bloodstream in order to elevate your body's ability to move gases to your muscles and stuff like that. Hemoglobin recycling, I'll just kind of touch on this real quick. I recommend you go through and spend some more time with this and really looking at that one. But basically, hemoglobin recycling, we want to break down those hemoglobin once the red blood cells die and try to salvage that iron. We don't want the iron just free floating in the blood and stuff like that, because that causes a lot of problems. Hemoglobin recycling is going to take place primarily in the spleen, liver, and bone marrow by cells called macrophages. They're sort of giant cell-eating monsters, basically. Part of the immune system. They're cleanup crew and stuff like that. So they're going to remove old and damaged red blood cells, remove the hemoglobin from that, break it down. The iron in the heme is recycled. Everything else is broken down and sort of shed away. Your body can't really absorb iron, so it gets stored in various forms with various chemicals. Eventually, what ends up happening is so it either makes its way to the bone marrow right here, where then it's recycled and used for red blood cell formation, or it is bound up into various chemicals like bilirubin. Buildup of bilirubin, by the way, is jaundice, because bilirubin is sort of yellowish. But basically what ends up happening is bilirubin is excreted by the liver in the form of bile, and then eventually basically you poop it out. So that's why one of the signs of liver failure is jaundice, is because you're not excreting this bilirubin. All right. Tell you what. I'm going to take a break. Okay, this one's gone on for a little while. So why don't you go get a drink of water, go back through maybe and look at this if you need to, and then come see me here in just a little bit. We'll talk about blood typing and clotting. If you have any questions after going through this video, talking about red blood cells and stuff like that, sort of introducing ourselves, please let me know. Send me an email, remind message, ask me in class, something like that. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing y'all again soon.